There are moments that arrive quietly and rearrange everything. Not dramatic moments, not arguments or revelations or nights that end in tears, just a sentence. 7 words from a woman sitting across a coffee table, said so simply and so sincerely that it took me the entire drive home to understand what it had cost her to say it. I wish my husband was like yours. She said it about a man I had spent 3 years complaining about, a man I had described as boring, as difficult, as someone who didn't understand me, a man whose habits had become the running thread of every conversation I had with the women in my life, the grievance I returned to so reliably that my friends had started finishing my sentences before I could. She wished her husband was like mine. My name is Beverly Wagner, and those 7 words are the reason I have not complained about my husband since. Subscribe before you go, because this story is about the moment you finally hear yourself through someone else's ears. Steve and I had been married for 9 years. We lived in Phoenix, Arizona, in a house that worked. Not glamorous, not the neighborhood we had originally imagined, but ours in the way that a home becomes yours after enough years of ordinary life inside it. Stephen was a high school science teacher, steady, methodical, the kind of man who graded papers at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings and never once complained about it. He coached the junior track team on Wednesdays after school without extra pay because someone had to, and he was the kind of man who showed up when something needed doing. He was also, and I said this often to anyone who would listen, intensely particular about certain things. The dishes had to be washed in a specific order. The thermostat had a preferred setting he guarded with quiet vigilance. He was in bed by 10 on weeknights without exception, which meant evenings out with my friends required a conversation I had come to dread. I called these things his quirks. I called them controlling in my more frustrated moments. I called them the subject of more conversations than I care to count now, looking back at the woman I was in those years. The one who sat across from her friends and itemized her husband's limitations like a woman building a case. Her name was Diane. We had been friends for 6 years, the kind of friendship built on proximity and then deepened over time into something that felt genuinely essential. Diane was funny and warm and generous with her time, the kind of person who remembered the things you mentioned in passing and showed up with exactly the right thing when you needed it. Her husband's name was Keith. I had met Keith perhaps a dozen times over 6 years, at birthday dinners, at a couple of neighborhood gatherings, once at a school event where we had all ended up at the same table by coincidence. Keith was charming in the way of men who have learned that charm is more useful than effort. He laughed loudly at his own jokes. He had opinions about everything and listened to almost nothing. What happened behind the closed door of Diane and Keith's marriage was not something Diane discussed openly. She deflected questions with humor, moved conversations forward when they drifted too close to the truth, and smiled in the specific way of someone who has become very practiced at it. I knew in the vague way you know things you haven't been directly told that Diane's marriage was not easy. I simply hadn't stopped talking about my own long enough to ask how hard it actually was. It was a Thursday afternoon in October. Diane had come over, nothing planned, just the easy drop-in of a long friendship, and we were sitting in the living room with coffee when Stephen arrived home from school. He came in the way he always did, coat on the hook, keys in the bowl, a brief stop in the kitchen to check whether I had eaten because I had a habit of working through lunch that he had never stopped monitoring quietly. He brought me a glass of water without being asked. He said hello to Diane warmly and genuinely asked how she was. He mentioned that he had picked up the ingredient I had forgotten on the grocery list on his way home because he had driven past the store and remembered. Then he excused himself to go grade his papers and left us to our conversation. Diane watched him go. Then she looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "I wish my husband was like yours." She said it quietly, not dramatically, not as a performance of her own unhappiness, but as a simple, honest statement she had apparently decided to stop keeping to herself. Before I told you what Diane told me next, subscribe right now, because what she said about Keith put 3 years of my complaints into a perspective I was not prepared for. I set down my cup. I asked her gently what she meant. What came out was not a flood. Diane was too measured for floods. It came out carefully, in the way of someone who has been organizing the truth for a long time and is finally choosing to share it in the right order. Keith forgot her birthday 2 years running, and both times only remembered when he saw other people's social media posts. Keith came home when he felt like it and offered explanations that didn't always hold up to gentle examination. Keith had opinions about how Diane spent her time, her money, and her friendships. Opinions he expressed freely while remaining completely unbothered about the equivalent questions she might have had about his. He had never once, she said, brought her a glass of water without being asked. He had never once noticed she hadn't eaten. He had never once remembered something from a grocery list because he happened to drive past a store. "The things you complain about," Diane said, and she said it without accusation, gently, the way you say a hard thing to someone you love, "are the things I have been wishing for." Diane didn't stay long after that. She had said what she had needed to say, and I think she needed to leave before it became something she had to manage. We hugged at the door, and I watched her drive away, and then I went back inside and sat in the living room for a long time. Stephen was at the kitchen table, papers spread out, red pen moving, the Sunday evening routine on a Thursday because a marking deadline had shifted. The thermostat was set to his preferred temperature. The dishes were stacked in the order he preferred. The house was running the way he needed it to run. And inside it, without ceremony or performance, was a man who had stopped at a grocery store on his way home because he remembered something I had forgotten. I thought about 3 years of conversations, about the words I had used, about the friends who had heard those words and nodded sympathetically, without knowing, as I had not known, that one of them was sitting in a house where the absence of what I had was the central grief of her daily life. I thought about what it must have cost Diane to say it. She had not said it to make me feel ashamed. She had said it because she could no longer sit across from someone cataloging the value of something they couldn't see and say nothing. I did not tell Stephen about the conversation immediately. I sat with it for several days first, not from guilt, which would have been the easier feeling, but from something more complicated, a reckoning with the gap between the husband I had and the story I had been telling about him. When I did tell him, on a Sunday evening at the kitchen table while he was between papers, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How is Diane?" Not, "I told you so." Not, "I know I'm a good husband." Just, "How is Diane?" That is the man I had been complaining about. Diane left Keith 8 months later. The details were hers to carry, and she carried them with the same quiet dignity she had brought to everything. She is doing better now, rebuilding in the slow, steady way of someone who waited too long to begin and has decided not to waste another day of it. I do not complain about Stephen anymore. Not to my friends, not under my breath, not in the comfortable venting way I had come to treat as harmless. Because I understand now that there is no such thing as harmless complaining about a man who brings you water without being asked. Not when someone you love is sitting across from you, wishing. The thermostat stays at his preferred temperature. I have made my peace with the dishes. And on the evenings he's in bed by 10, I sit in the quiet house and think about how much I would miss it if it were gone. I want to speak to every woman who has made her husband the subject of a running complaint without asking herself what she would have without him. There is a specific comfort in venting. It feels like honesty. It feels like connection. The easy solidarity of shared frustration, the warmth of friends nodding across a table while you describe the man who loads the dishwasher wrong, or keeps the house too cold, or falls asleep before the film ends. It feels harmless because nobody gets hurt in the retelling. But somewhere in that retelling, you stop seeing the man you have. You see only the version of him that generates the story. And that version is so much smaller than the real one. The one who stopped at the grocery store, who noticed you hadn't eaten, who said how Diane is when you confessed your guilt. Because his first instinct was concern for someone else's pain. Look at what you have before you describe what's missing. Look carefully, because someone in your life may be looking at the same thing and calling it everything they ever wanted. Diane came for coffee again last month. Stephen brought us both a glass of water without being asked. And she smiled the way she smiles now. Not the practiced one, the real one. I noticed. I think she did too. Share in the comments. Has someone ever said something that made you see your husband completely differently? Or have you been guilty of complaining about something you would grieve if it were gone? I read every single comment, and your story matters. Subscribe to True Lens Stories for new, honest marriage narratives every day. Thank you for watching, and God bless every woman brave enough to look at what she has before she loses the ability to see it clearly.